This is Sang-Si Bei reporting from the Censor Studio. Currently, the United States is becoming polarized and appears to be growing more divided. In such a situation, President Trump of the United States is growling about invoking the Insurrection Act, which is essentially martial law in society. Today, let's take a look at the current situation in the United States. Let's get right to it. Right now, large-scale protests are breaking out one after another in places like Chicago and Portland. The protests opposed immigration enforcement. Especially in these areas, which are strongholds of Democratic support, President Trump responded by deploying federal troops. On September 27th, President Trump stated that key facilities in Portland, such as immigration and customs enforcement and law enforcement agencies, were being attacked by radical leftist groups. He invoked the authority to command the National Guard and announced that he would immediately deploy 200 troops to carry out the mission. In Chicago, the National Guard is already stationed at the United States Army Reserve Training Center in a church on the outskirts. They are just waiting for the order to be deployed. At this time, an institution stepped in to block President Trump's actions, and that was the United States Federal Court. The United States Federal Court blocked President Trump's plan to deploy the National Guard to Portland twice. The United States Court unusually held an emergency hearing on a Sunday via a conference call. They ruled that National Guard troops couldn't be sent to Oregon. The United States Court strongly criticized the federal government's actions, stating that no emergency situation had occurred in Oregon and that there was no legal basis or necessity for deploying the military. In response, President Trump referred to Portland as an insurrection during an interview with reporters, saying that there was so much crime happening in Portland that it should be considered an insurrection. He announced he would invoke the Insurrection Act. Let's examine it more closely. As noted, the Insurrection Act is a type of martial law. Enacted in 1807, this law lets the president deploy the military against citizens. On the surface, it looks like a law for restoring order, but if you look inside, you'll see that it's actually a tool that allows the president to declare martial law at will. The first provision of this law states that when a state government is unable to control a riot or rebellion on its own, it can request assistance from the federal government. If the governor or the state legislature makes an official request, the president can deploy the military. During the 1992 Los Angeles riots, President Bush Sr. sent the National Guard and federal troops at California's governor's request to stop the unrest. The real issue begins with the second clause. The law allows the president to deploy the military without a state government's request, at his own discretion. If rebellion, violence, unlawful assembly, or conspiracy occurs within a state and the enforcement of federal law becomes impossible, or if citizens' constitutional rights are violated as a result and the state authorities are unable or unwilling to protect them, the president can use the military. That's what it says. The law provides no way to verify or control the decision. Neither congressional nor state government approval is needed. If the president claims law enforcement is impossible, the military can be deployed. Shockingly, this rule is overly broad. If you interpret the wording literally, the Insurrection Act can be invoked even if just two people conspire to violate federal law. If the president calls this an insurrection, deploying the military is legally justified. This is what President Trump wants now. He is defining the anti-government protests happening in cities like Portland, Chicago, and Los Angeles as riots on the level of insurrection. State governors oppose the deployment, but Trump said, if the state can't protect its citizens, I will. That statement refers to military intervention under the Insurrection Act, which President Trump has previously considered invoking. This time, there is analysis suggesting that he is highly likely to actually issue the order. The problem is that once this law is invoked, it is very difficult to reverse. The military's intervention will continue unless the president orders it lifted. For Parliament to keep it in check, it must pass a new bill, but that process is lengthy and politically tough. Since the Republican Party holds the majority, passing bills or resolutions is difficult. Protests are ongoing in Chicago and Portland. On October 4th in southwest Chicago, a federal agent doing immigration enforcement shot and wounded a United States citizen driver. Protests over immigration enforcement are spreading, with hundreds or thousands joining the demonstrations. Protesters yelled at United States immigration and customs enforcement agents and blocked their vehicles. They waved Mexican and American flags and shouted at United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement to leave their homes. United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement and police used tear gas and projectiles to disperse protesters and break up the crowd. Right now, the situation in Chicago and Portland literally resembles a war zone. The sounds of tear gas and sirens continue day and night. The scene is completely filled with tension. But the bigger problem is the political conflict. Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson and Illinois Governor J. Robert Pritzker harshly criticized the Trump administration, claiming the federal government is making the city a battlefield. From the perspective of local governments, the federal government is taking away their authority to control their own cities. On the other hand, the federal government claims that local governments are the cause of the problem. Homeland Security Secretary Chad Wolf accused Chicago and Portland officials of ignoring crime and lying about local conditions. He warned leaders must face consequences for knowingly spreading falsehoods. This statement targeted local governments. He justified deploying the National Guard, claiming citizens are now much safer. In other words, the federal government's logic is that the current military intervention is an inevitable choice for maintaining public order. However, public opinion in the United States is sharply divided over this. Republican supporters see it as a strong decision to restore order, while the Democratic Party and progressives criticize it as a clear threat to democracy. But President Trump plans to go further by invoking the Insurrection Act to gain more power. The Insurrection Act is a broad law that lets the president legally deploy the military anywhere, anytime. That's why this law is considered so dangerous. It's often said that it can be interpreted any way you want, depending on how you use it. President Trump has deployed or may deploy troops to at least 10 cities, such as Baltimore, Memphis, Washington, District of Columbia, New Orleans, Oakland, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. All these cities are Democratic Party strongholds. Troops are being deployed only to opposition strongholds, making this more a political statement than a public safety measure. President Trump is emphasizing the image that he is in control and will restore order even if there is opposition. He's also demonstrating federal power to Democratic mayors and governors. If this continues, the conflict between the central and local governments will grow. If the federal government sends in the military, local governments will object, claiming citizens' freedoms are threatened. This could spark more protests, leading to repeated military deployments and a continuing cycle. The United States is currently in a political, not physical, war. Once President Trump invokes the Insurrection Act, the issue will shift from suppressing protests to determining who holds United States sovereignty. Ultimately, it could be a moment that tests how much American democracy can endure. President Trump invoking the Insurrection Act isn't just about stopping protests, it's a calculated political move. First, the main priority is strengthening his support base. President Trump's core supporters prioritize order and strong leadership. As chaos, street fires, and protests intensify, people increasingly want a strong leader. President Trump gets that mindset. That's why he deliberately uses words like lawlessness, rebellion, and insurrection to create a sense of crisis among the people, and tries to solidify his image as the one who will restore order in the midst of that crisis. When this happens, President Trump's supporters grow even more united, forming a solid base. The United States is deeply divided by politics, and now faces a battle over political framing. Labeling protests as riots or insurrections instantly strips opposing groups of legitimacy. Legally and morally, they are branded as forces opposing the state. Whether it's truly a time of peace or not doesn't really matter. Once a frame is set, people usually see things through it. Even if the president sends in the military, it's labeled suppression and the other side is seen as disrupting the nation. When such a frame is created, public opinion quickly shifts in favor of Trump, and it can also test the limits of the system. Because the Insurrection Act is open to interpretation, President Trump plans to test its limits. Even if he doesn't actually deploy the military, he's testing how far the executive branch's authority can reach through statements and the process of spreading knowledge. If these precedents add up, future presidents' authority will grow. Even if courts block it temporarily, unless this vague clause changes, President Trump will keep using the Insurrection Act as leverage. These calculations show that President Trump is trying to create a situation in his favor. Of course, there are significant risks involved in these calculations. If the military is politicized, the judiciary steps in, and international criticism grows, President Trump's power could be weakened. In the end, this is a thoroughly calculated gamble. To appear as a strong leader and to rally his supporters, the president is politically using one of the dangerous laws. The problem is, if this continues, the United States risks crossing an irreversible bridge of deeper polarization, which is the biggest issue. Share your thoughts on the current situation in the United States in the comments. Thanks for watching.